we are delighted to welcome you all to the Natural History Museum and to this brand new Commons Theater. Our new discussion series, Elephant in the Room, Small Talk, Big Issues, tackles thought-provoking and sometimes controversial topics in the museum world and elsewhere. This year, the series complements NHM's latest exhibition, Reframing Dioramas, The Art of Preserving Wilderness, which offers a fresh perspective on these iconic and historic displays, and which will be on view following this discussion as well. So on behalf of the museum, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for the Elephant in the Room series this season. As a neuroscientist turned science communicator, she strives to bridge the gap between science and culture and is driven by the belief that science isn't just for scientists and has the power to connect people and communities. Please give a big hand to our moderator for this evening, Dr. Yewande Pearse.
Thank you so much, Marisol, for the warm introduction. And hello, everyone, and welcome to Elephant in the Room, Small Talk, Big Issues. So great to see all of you here in this new space, and we're excited for this discussion, which is dioramas, art, or science. We'll explore the world of dioramas from their historical roots to their cultural and modern day significance. What makes a diorama? How have the intricate displays shaped our understanding of the natural world, both positively and negatively? And we'll dive into the ethical considerations surrounding the acquisition and collections and the delicate balance between art and science in creating these immersive scenes. Finally, we'll explore the future of dioramas and how they should evolve to continue educating, inspiring, and challenging audiences for years to come. So a lively discussion ahead, hopefully. So I'm super excited to introduce our guest for the discussion. Please welcome Saul Becker, the artist behind the diorama A Peculiar Garden, also in the Reframing Diorama exhibit. In addition to being an exhibiting artist, he is also a partner in Muta Studio, a Seattle-based architecture and design studio. Next, I'd love to welcome Yesenia Prieto, one of the artists behind the diorama A Delicate Moment in Time in the Reframing Dioramas exhibit. She's a Los Angeles-born designer and founder of Pinata Design Studio, which merges culture with generational artistry. Welcome, Yesenia. And last but not least, NHM's own Dr. Matt Davis, currently the exhibition content developer at NHM LAC. He is also a conservation biologist, paleontologist, and diorama historian, and the editor of Fabricating Wilderness, the Habitat Dioramas of the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Welcome. Okay, it's so wonderful to have you on this panel. I think the best place to start is probably with the origins and purpose of dioramas. So Fabricating Wilderness, which actually I have a copy here, and just hold it up for everyone to see. Fabricating Wilderness explores the untold history of NHM's dioramas. The book is a great read. I mean, it offers fascinating insights into how these immersive exhibits were meticulously crafted by scientists, artists, and adventurers, while also revealing how they reflect evolving perspectives on conservation, colonialism, and museum storytelling. These are themes that we're going to cover during the discussion this evening, but first let's start with the basics, which is what are the key components of a diorama and which techniques were used to merge artistry and science in their creation. And that's for you, Dr. Davis.
So dioramas, it's just a 3D recreation of a scene, and that can be the little shoebox dioramas you make when you're kids, all the way up to the big dioramas we have at the museum. The ones in our diorama halls are a special kind. They're called habitat groups. And what that basically means is that they have a curved background that's painted. They have a foreground with some fake plants and trees and rocks. And then they have taxidermy, the heroes of the show, the actual animals that are in the diorama. And I know our title is Art or Science. I'm going to make a bold statement right here. Dioramas, 100% art. I think we're done, right? We can go on to the cocktail reception.
That you'll want to talk about the intersection. Okay, plot twist. Carry on.
I think one of our first leaders of our diorama program, Melville Lincoln, put it best in that science furnishes the material, art the finished picture. So what I mean when I say they're art is, I think they're amazing, great works of art, but they're scientifically accurate. works of art. So, they could set up the scene how they want, just how you would normally set up a painting. They think about composition and balance, but the mountains they're painting better be real mountains. That red flower that you're putting in the center of the scene, that better be a flower that's actually found in that habitat.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, the dioramas being art and the artistic craftsmanship that goes into the dioramas is definitely, you can't be ignored. I was looking at them yesterday, and just those scenes are so real and lifelike and undeniably need an artist's skill to produce. They're quite a departure from kind of what you would see in museums before dioramas are around, which is just these skeleton, artifacts, which I guess were aimed more at an academic or scholar audience. How have dioramas kind of changed the field of natural history in that way?
I think they really opened up natural history museums. So if you would have come to our museum 100 years ago, before our dioramas came in, you would find a lot of cases, row after row of just bones and shells and rocks, everything lined up, really long, boring labels. I write the labels now, so don't say they're boring. They're shorter. But dioramas just blew up. They just burst onto the scene with all this color. I mean, these would have been amazing. People would have never seen anything like this in their lives. They've probably never even seen a color photo of most of these animals or a color picture in a book. And just to have this full 3D reconstruction, it allowed museums to tell a story without a label, right? So anyone can come in off the street and you see a polar bear and you go, oh, why does it have white fur? Well, because it's to match its snowy habitat. What does it do with its long claws? Oh, it's using them to grab that seal that it's eating. I know it's a carnivore now. You can tell all these things about an animal without ever having to read a label or really know much about anatomy or anything like that. And I think that's what made dioramas so special back then.
And I mean, even when you see them today, they are completely awe-inspiring. The fact that they're to scale, and then you just sort of look up and you see this very lifelike creature that you probably don't even get the opportunity to see in a zoo, it's really impactful. We're going to move on to talking a little bit more about the art and science intersection. But Dr. Davis, you've mentioned before the idea of a museum man who really, I guess, shepherded the whole kind of diorama thing into the future. So what is a museum man, and kind of what is that sort of relevance to this art science tension?
Yeah, so when dioramas were first getting popular in the early 1900s, science was really starting to get specialized. People were going into their small little areas, and laboratory science was really the hot thing. And so these museum men were kind of a rebellion against that. They're saying, you can't just look in a test tube and understand nature. You need to get out in the world. And you can't just be a scientist. You need to be everything. So you should be an explorer, a hunter, a taxidermist, an artist, be able to give great talks, be able to write books. And these were the people that really started the diorama programs at museums all around the country. And I don't think dioramas would have caught on in the craze that they did without these people, because they were really stern. They were obstinate, maybe. These people believed in their mission. They really wanted to conserve species, and they just put dioramas in. They made it happen. And what we see today, the three-dimensional diorama that's still in our museum, that was just part of it. If you were around back then, you would have had these dispatches from the field when they're out on their expedition. They would have come back and given these amazing lecture circuits with the pictures of their expedition, and everyone would see it. And so it was part of this whole big promotional campaign to think about these species, to think about these habitats. And I should mention, even though the term that's passed down to us is museum men, a lot of them were actually women. These museum,
I figured, I guess, probably.
These museum men would marry these crazy explorer, women that went out into the jungle and, captured apes and things like that. So they often actually worked as couple teams.
Which, I mean, it's a segue to Yesenia and Saul, just thinking about this blending of science and art. So I just wanted to take a moment to share some of my reflections on your beautiful pieces. So A Peculiar Garden and A Delicate Moment in Time are currently in the exhibition, and they really push beyond the traditional craftsmanship, transforming them into immersive and thought-provoking experience. They go way beyond foreground and background, painting skills. So when I saw your piece, it really presented to me like this dystopian world where the nature feels altered, the kind of the orangey hue feels like some sort of toxic landscape. You have electroplated plants, charred wood, and like oil slick water that the animals are drinking from. So it really creates this sense of environmental disruption. And then you have these huge crystals and taxidermy, which like blurs that line between preservation and decay. So it's kind of unsettling. And then Yesenia, your diorama is just, it's so dreamy. It almost feels alive. It's dynamic. You have these shifting colors and vibrant creatures and this ethereal landscape, which is so emotive. And it really invites viewers, I think, into this cosmic, immersive, dreamlike world where you're blending science and myth. So clearly both pieces are more than just, artistic craftsmanship. So I'd be really interested to hear, kind of given all of those elements, how you see science and art interacting in your work. Do they serve separate roles or do they merge into something new? So I'd love to hear your perspective.
Oh, thank you. Reflecting on that, I really think it's interesting to me how both science and art are exploratory. And, science is trying to explain and quantify and give us a sense of how nature works. But it's really our understanding up to this moment. We're always rethinking the conclusions that we've come to. Is Pluto a planet or is it a large, meteor? Like, these things are still up in the air and we're always sort of rewriting it. And art in the same way is about exploring the world and about trying to understand it in a more abstract and maybe more emotional way. So I think it's interesting to approach a diorama from a point of view of not being a craftsman trying to construct somebody's image of a diorama, but to take that diorama into a new place and create a work that is not necessarily completely described. It's an experience that can mean many things for many people. But also within my project, there was a lot of science. All the plants are electroplated, which is an electrochemical process. So my studio looks a lot like a mad scientist lab. I've got vats of acid and power supplies and a lot of glassware and laboratory equipment. I think I'm probably on a terrorist watch list because
I would assume so.
Because I've bought a lot of acid in the last few years. So it is very scientific, and I think keen-eyed botanists will look in my diorama and see that some of those plants actually don't exist. That I've grafted some plants together, and through that electroplating process, I've grown this copper skin on them, which is a bit of a play on preserving nature. Preserving nature is a very abstract idea. Nature is the one thing that doesn't stop. And this idea of stopping time is a very strange idea. And so to coat these plants with this kind of technology is a way to really highlight the uncanniness of that attempt to stop time. Personally, I've just been really inspired by that scientific process, and working in the museum has been really incredible to be including some of the specimens from the taxidermy to the mineral samples. It's just been really inspiring to walk through and see all these incredible things that have been collected and presented to the public here at the museum.
It's really interesting, actually, that your piece does include existing taxidermy, and we're talking before the discussion about, I had kind of gone around to some of the dioramas. I don't know if the audience agree, but they have such nice whimsical looks on their faces. A lot of the dioramas, they look so happy, and then the two in your diorama drinking from that oil slicked water, they just don't seem okay. So I think it's really interesting kind of how it changes the meaning as well and the narrative. Yesenia, your diorama also, I'm sure, merges science into the artwork itself. Would love to hear kind of your process and that delineation, what that looks like for you.
So yeah, we were definitely inspired by the Natural History Museum and the artwork and the teams here that have put together such beautiful displays. And I think when we were going to take on this endeavor, I think there was definitely a huge intention to pay respect to how much science and research went into trying to relay important information to the public. With art, you can taken in so many different directions. And I think one of the main themes is like, yes, like we want to be accurate to what we're like displaying, like meaning all the animals, even though they're all whimsical and they're different interpretation, they actually are real species. But in terms of like representing the artists, like part of it, it's like, I mean, the human experience in itself is pretty interesting. Not like science is beautiful, but it's also mysterious.
Mm-hmm.
Like it can
Sure.
seem like very black and white, but if you really think about it, like there are aspects of it that are pretty unexplainable, you know, like what's the purpose of dreams, or what happens when you die, or like, you know, these other like kinds of questions where you can't really define what life is. You know, you can have this image of it, and I think that's what we're trying to relay. But like, yes, this is like these animals, like they're all on the California special species list. And
That actually surprised me. You know, I was working with you and looking at your label, and I said, oh, this species, it actually got taken off the special species list because it's not endangered anymore. And you were like, oh, we can't put it in the diorama. And I said, no, we're opening in a day. Like, you've already made this this bird, you know? And you were like, no, this has to be 100% scientifically accurate. And I was so impressed by that.
Yeah, I think
And we're talking about, you know, it was like gold-plated piñata bird, you know, got to think, no, it's accurate.
Yeah, we did a lot of research because, yeah, we want people to connect with these species in a way that's like you can see them around right now. Like when you're like, so it's different, like sacred, well, I call it sacred, but like, or we, you know, like Joshua Tree is represented, Yosemite Falls is represented, Curtin River is in there, the steps of City Hall are in there, and there's all these little Easter eggs of the different biomes, and we wanted to place the animals in those biomes and kind of create this like, just like, kind of like a dreamscape.
Like it feels like that, very much so.
Yeah, like you can connect with animals in real life, but also there's this other aspect of human experience that you're like, we're all experiencing in different, like dream, right? Like what would these animals look like in a different like kind of perspective or dimension, in a different universe? Like they still have that energy and that essence. So I think we took the opportunity to kind of relay these animals in a specific way, because sometimes when you see something in a different perspective, you appreciate it more. And I think it's important. Like sometimes, and this is something that when we went to the museum and we were talking to all the people here, and we were trying to understand like how they felt about the species. And some of the people here, they're like, oh, you know, I wish people knew more about the pocket mouse, but people usually overlook it because he's so small, and they wouldn't understand that he's like on the brink of being on the endangered species list. And it's like, okay, so that's interesting. So what if we put him all in purple and like neon colors and made him bigger than usual and played with perspective? Then you can't like look, you can't help but not look, you know, you're going to pay attention in a different way.
And I think that goes to the original purpose of dioramas, that instead of looking at a skull, you know, this lifeless thing, when you see this animal all in its habitat together with all the species it lives with, the trees, everything, you appreciate so much more, and you're just continuing on with that tradition.
Exactly. And I think it's important, especially, you know, having the opportunity as like the younger like generation, like different perspective. Like I think the fact that the Natural History Museum invited that was so amazing, because now it's like we have different like life experiences that affect how we create, being technological or being like from different cultures or whatever. And but I think it was a really important like opportunity to also like, out of respect, like be scientific, but just add that twist, you know?
Absolutely. And I think it's also the meaning making in the science part and how you think about the science. And both of your pieces, like Saul, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, in a bit, but like the question of nature and definitions in science is kind of played with. And then Yesenia, like the real spiritual element of the work, really, I mean, that's beyond, I mean, science can go so far, and then it's like the art picks up the narrative and takes us somewhere else, but it's all meaning making and what audiences connect with, which is really powerful. I wanted to talk about the elephant in the room. So we're going to talk about ethical and cultural reassessments. Dr. Davis, let's talk about the colonialism which is embedded in everything, both historically today, in the past, so it comes as no surprise that it's played a significant role in specimen collection. But it'd be really great to kind of unpack a little bit about how this colonial power structure shaped the early dioramas, like how that actually played out.
So dioramas have this really noble educational purpose and this conservation purpose. They were created to preserve these species, but they're also an example of kind of the imperial might of different cities. So dioramas are really an American phenomenon. And you have cities like New York and Chicago and LA. They want to show how big and powerful they are. And one of the ways you do that is you go out to the farthest reaches of the earth and you bring back a whole habitat, not just an animal, but a whole recreation of this environment back to your people, your citizens. And they were able to do that because we were collecting in a lot of places that were colonies. I mean, if you look at our old specimen records, you see British East Africa or Northern Rhodesia. These are countries that don't exist anymore. They were parts of Africa ruled by Europeans. And they had laws that favored rich foreigners over the hunting privileges of, hunters that just needed the food to live, to shoot that gazelle. But it was easier for us to shoot that gazelle and bring it back here. I think one of the bigger things, though, that we're still dealing with today is that these were scenes of Africa created by Angelenos. Our African Hall was not made by Africans. And so it's people living here, their interpretation of another place. Mm. And even Melville Lincoln, who created our African Hall, had never even been to Africa. He's reading books, he's looking at pictures in the National Geographic, trying to figure out what this entire continent looks like, right?
Yeah, it's a departure from science. It's not accurate, and it's the projection piece. And also another kind of really striking part of dioramas is that many of these dioramas, they display an idealized and static view of nature. They omit any sign of human impact. And they depict an untouched wilderness, erasing histories, cultures, and really importantly, the ongoing presence of indigenous peoples and other communities. So, I mean, the Diorama Hall has been reopened, and just thinking about how museums can be thoughtful in preserving these dioramas as they are, the purpose obviously being conservation, which I'm sure you'll speak a little bit about, but also confronting this erasure, which is really, obvious.
I should say that even from the early days of dioramas, this virgin nature idea was controversial among the artists. There were a lot who said, this just isn't realistic. Let's paint a farm or a field or something in the background. I mean, people have been living in these habitats for thousands of years. And so you will see some in our museum and in others that have, little fields in the background. One of our most popular dioramas is the coyote in LA's backyard. It's a coyote sitting in a pool with a dead house cat in its mouth that it's just caught. People love it because they're like, hey, that's my habitat. I live here. And I think what you can do is just hit the problem head on. So for example, at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, they just put some pictures of cities on the intro label for their African Diorama Hall. And it seems really simple, but suddenly you read that and you're like, oh yeah, Tanzania and Kenya actually have cities larger than LA. Africa, not just zebras. People live here. Millions and millions of people live and do things here. With our dioramas, we're lucky that they can change. The window, the big glass just opens like a window. So we've actually added in a lot of human content inside the dioramas, and with our new labels that are on all 4 diorama halls now, we call out where humans would have been in these scenes in a lot of them. So go look and you're going to find a little can or a little speck of trash or some evidence that humans have been in these habitats for a long time.
And I think that really, Saul, if anyone knows about human influence on wildlife, I think it'll be you and your diorama. So just interested to hear a little bit about how both of your work engages or departs from these problematic aspects of dioramas, whether it's the colonial aspect or, the erasure of human in these scenes and that nature-civilization divide that has been created. Saul, could you talk a little bit about how A Peculiar Garden confronts that?
Yeah. There's so many jump-off points for that. If you'd asked somebody 50 years ago to describe nature or what it means within society, it's so different from the world we live in now. Our conception of nature has really changed. And looking at the history of landscape painting, you see over the years just how how much these conceptions are really rooted in these old ideas. And so for me, I think approaching the piece was how closely can I stay true to the form factor of the diorama, but also reference the way our relationship with nature has changed. It's much more uncomfortable and unsure than it was, even 25 years ago. So I really wanted to create a scene that was beautiful enough to draw you in, but it created a place that you didn't want to stay. And dealing with nature and plants and animals in a way that references this unease that exists. Everything is really referencing preservation and the stoppage of time, but it's a bit post-apocalyptic.
It feels that way. It's the orange. The orange is like nice, but then apocalyptic.
And I think we've all seen a lot of orange light in the last few months. So yeah, the diorama is full of burnt wood, and over the years, I live in the Pacific Northwest, and whenever there's a forest fire, we get this gorgeous golden light, which as a painter I'd look at and I go, oh, it's so beautiful. But it really is much more unnerving when you think about the causes.
Yeah.
But even when you explore those causes aren't unnatural. Forest fires occur and have occurred for a long time. And sometimes even the suppression of fires can fuel the next one 10 years down. So it's really a slippery slope. And when you talk about preservation of nature, like Yosemite, they have I can't remember what time frame it is that they're trying to preserve in the park, but at one time, let's say the giant bighorn sheep weren't present in the park 50 million years ago, and so they want to eradicate them. And then the sheep start moving in, and we're going like, how is this preserving this natural place if we're having to impose this timeline on it? So the way we define nature is very unusual, and it's much more about our psychology than it is about the reality. A lot of the plants in my diorama are weeds that have been collected and electroplated. Well, a weed is not a scientific definition. Really, those are wildflowers. It's just that we don't have much use for these plants that we call them weeds. They're really medicinal herbal plants.
I feel like, that's a really good point. Like the value aspect that you ascribe to them must come from us, like the way we view it and where we put it in nature. I feel like that's really clear in that diorama, and kind of the closer you look, the more you see sort of those like unsettling human influences without the humans actually being in the diorama.
And where does it stop? Are we natural? Is what we do part of our nature? Some of the first organisms that started to breathe air, they started to breathe air because they created conditions in the water that was so full of carbon dioxide that they couldn't survive. So they mutated so they could start to breathe air. Right now we're living in a world full of microplastics. And at some point, some organism will realize there's a glut of this material, and it will adapt and start to eat it. Just like you don't see a lot of wood from certain periods of the past because there were no microorganisms that could digest cellulose. And then at one point, microorganisms realized that there was a bunch of this material, and then they started to eat it. So there's whole periods of time where you just don't see a lot of that material. So it's always changing, but we see ourselves outside of nature, and cancer is outside of nature. All these things that we don't like are outside of nature, and yet they all exist because they're interacting with the system.
And adapting. That's what's really interesting. It's how nature adapts and how we adapt to nature. Yesenia, would love to hear kind of your perspective on how the work either directly engages with some of those like more problematic themes associated with traditional dioramas, or is inherent in your work. For example, all of your little creatures are made from materials that didn't come from animals captured in the wild.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole scene in itself is like kind of a culmination of like the times now, like a huge like part of that is like even the projections and like the, you know, this everything being lit up and create, and there is a story being told in the scene that is like, you know, the life cycle of humans and this experience of like birth to friendship to love to chaos, friendship and like destruction and like rebirth and ascension. And essentially, I definitely see also like the intention of human presence with like the steps being like very like that's like human made versus like nature, and embracing that like we are all together. And yes, like all the animals with intention, like we definitely you know wanted to think about conservation and recycling, especially being in this generation where that's all we are kind of like shifting to think about, because now we're learning like the effects and repercussions of what, you know, like if we continue in a certain direction, like is that what we want at the end of the day? I mean, it is a part of the human experience and there are ups and downs, but I think what kind of like story, or what do you want to leave behind? What do you want to remember yourself like thinking about and paying respect to? And I think especially with us and using recycled materials and being very conscientious about that and scraps, it's like I think it was also an opportunity to be able to create with limited resources, you know, and showing people that you can still find beauty in a lot of like circumstances. But I definitely see this as an opportunity not only just like to like, I know we were showcasing animals and like like the theme is like transitory nature and time, you know? And if we can capture this moment and pay attention to this moment and see the beauty in this moment and understand that these, like especially with the story of these animals, like they might not be around for that much longer, but it's just like me and you, like we're not going to be around for that much longer either. So I think the importance was like just appreciating the moment, you know, like understanding and respecting the chaos and the destruction, but also understanding and that if you appreciate it at the end of the day, like that's one of the most beautiful things that you can do right now.
And it works. So standing in front of your diorama, like time just passes. I just found myself just staring at the moving, shifting lights, and I think that I think that's a really salient point. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I mean, I personally am really into like cyber and like embracing it. I know there's like a huge like kind of like divide sometimes of like, oh, technology and blah 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 blah, but in itself, like it is like it's amazing like how we've evolved like these times. Like if you imagine someone from the past like just being here in this moment, they're like, what is going on, you know?
Actually, there was a little kid who was looking at your diorama when I was there, and he ran over and he was like, oh my goodness, this is the coolest thing ever. So yeah, I agree. That actually is a good segue to talk about sort of the contemporary reinterpretation of dioramas. And Matt, one of the things I've been really interested in for this whole exhibition is how long it was closed for, and then to reopen it and then sort of have to try and reimagine these narratives. And you kind of touched on this earlier in the discussion, but just would love you to say a little bit more on how, without changing the dioramas themselves, even though I know they change, like the narrative and kind of the direction you're moving in.
Yeah, so we did a lot of visitor research, and we know that when visitors go up to our dioramas, they see them as real scenes. Like, oh, here's the mama bear, here's the papa bear. And we wanted to disrupt that, to reframe that. So all the new interventions that we have in reframing dioramas, they're to make you pause for a little bit and actually think of these not as a real scene of nature, but as a work of art. And that's not to say a negative thing. That's to appreciate them as a work of art. When you think about all the people that had to go all around the world to bring back these plants and animals, and all the craftspeople and the painters that had to make this scene, and why they're trying to make that to save these species, I think you appreciate that history a lot more. And I think you appreciate how much work has gone into that, you know, like that these have been around for 100 years. Not much that we do today will be around for 100 years. But back in 1925, when our dioramas opened, They created the bison diorama because they thought bison might not be around that long, right? They wanted to create this scene to preserve it for future generations so their grandchildren could come in one day and see what bison look like. And I think that's a pretty powerful message as an artist, to try to create something that will impact the world, a century after you're gone.
Yeah, super powerful. It's kind of like funeral art, like this kind of pessimistic view that they're not going to be around.
Dioramas are super pessimistic.
So capture them.
They worked, right? Like, that's what's amazing about them. They didn't know they were going to work. 100 years ago, they built these scenes, and they're saying, we have to do this before it's too late. Like, this animal could just disappear, and no one will ever know that it existed. And not just this animal, this landscape.
Yeah.
Right? You'll see these really, what are now famous national parks and things in our scenes, but they weren't national parks when they were first painted, a lot of these. They were trying to preserve this whole landscape, the animals, the plants inside them. And they thought, well, if we can't save them through conservation, if this doesn't inspire people, then at least it will be a record. At least it will remind us of what we've lost.
Yeah, and it's interesting that most of I might be wrong, but a lot of the species in the diorama halls are actually not endangered anymore. So it has worked. But I mean, that brings me to Yesenia and Saul. It's not all roses. There's a lot of other things that we need to be focusing on. Climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental justice means that is actually more desperate now than ever. So just wondering how your approach to dioramas reflect this shift in urgency. Saul, like, you focus a lot on what grows back in places and like this kind of more resilience adaptation idea. So I'd love to get your perspective.
I think art is about the conditions of its own making in a lot of ways, and it makes time visible. I went to the Arctic a couple years ago on an ice class schooner, and we sailed very close to the North Pole, and I painted these paintings of the Arctic, and the very first images of the Arctic were paintings, because before photography, that was the only way we could make pictures. And for me, being a contemporary painter, approaching that same subject so many years later was a way of making time visible. It was a way of crystallizing time. And so much of the diorama for me was about like entropy, and how do we create a scene that is really about sort of the immutability of time. The crystallization of time, and like one of my favorite descriptions of entropy is if you took a sandbox and half of the sandbox was all white sand, and half the sandbox was all black sand, and you put a child in there and say, run around 10 times in a circle, and you can't tell that child to run counterclockwise now, and the sand will be back the way it was. So there's a lot of energy locked up in things, and I think, as we're realizing the impacts of climate change, and, we're realizing how much of that time has been locked into the environment. And it's really critical that we think about that. I kind of bristle sometimes when people say we need to save the planet. It's such an abstract idea. And I think we have to think about it more selfishly. Like, we have to take care of the planet because we want to live in it. We want to have clean water. We want to have clean air. The planet will be just fine. It'll have a little ice age.
It's true.
We'll all be gone, and then it'll bounce back. But for our own interest, I think we have to really take care of it. And I think that is an easier thing for people to understand than this really abstract idea of saving the planet.
Thanks for that. That's really, really a really good point. Yesenia, I'm also wondering kind of what your perspective is on that, like how this urgency, how you're addressing that in your work. I know that one thing that you are very passionate about is inviting younger generations in, and they're the ones who are going to be impacted.
Yeah, I mean, definitely with this generation, especially with like the dawning of the internet, information is being like passed so much faster, meaning that a lot of us are a lot more wiser than previous generations. So we're ingesting information at a rapid rate in such a way where it's kind of like if you if you don't do anything, it's kind of a little bit irresponsible in a way, like a little bit in denial of a way, like that you do have impact, that what you do matters. It actually does. Before in the past, you'd be like, well, it doesn't really matter if I throw this stone in the water, like there's going to be no ripple effect. Like who cares what, I have no importance. But that's so far from the truth. If you look at the science, it's like indisputable. And I think it's really important not only like to recognize your power as like a person, but also to recognize the responsibility, and also just understand that the earth is like, it's literally like Mother Earth. You think about Mother Earth, right? Like if it was it's a living like entity, it has its own energy. It's not just a rock that has nothing, it's no substance, it's taking care of us, right? And what does that look like if you're just constantly abusing it and like thinking that you have like it doesn't need to be taken care of? You know, it's a really like sad, unfortunate like way to think about things, in my opinion, because like how you do one thing is how you do a lot of things in life, right? Like in your relationship with like each other, like how do you want to remember your relationship just like one-on-one? Like personally, I think being kind to other people, being understanding that if you say something very like abusive to this person, it actually has a negative impact on their mind, that actually has a negative impact on the environment and everyone around them, because that affects them. So if we think about the earth in that same kind of way, like, oh, well, if I just like, you know, like build this oil company and doesn't matter, like I'm just going to get all this money and who cares because I'm just going to die anyways and I'm going to be happy. It's like,
no, yeah, exactly. It comes back to the energy point that you're making. So like it's this energy, and dioramas, like Dr. Davis, you're saying they were powerful, and like that idea of conservation just by purely being so awe-inspiring. But I feel like in both of your works, would you say that dioramas are still as powerful now and have the opportunity moving forward into the future to be impactful in that way and convey that message?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think anyone who's looked at a diorama or seen a child look at a diorama can't help but feel like it is a moving experience. And I have, you know, very distinct memories of seeing dioramas. It's incredible to be able to project yourself into a space. And so I'm very excited about the future of dioramas, you know, including, you know, more contemporary views of what they could be. And it's a beautiful art form. It's worth continuing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yesenia, anything to add to that?
100%. I think anything that kind of shifts your perspective in a like positive direction, and I say positive because a lot of the people that are creating these pieces have really good intentions to relay information, to connect with people, and to make a difference in like a very impactful way, you know, like kind of like what you were saying earlier about like kids coming up to the piece and that having an effect on them. You know, like our intention is for that to have like a positive effect on them, so when they grow up they can reflect and be like, wow, that was like a very beautiful moment, or that was a very beautiful like interpretation of like creatures that like maybe of course, like you see, they love animals. They love like, and we do too. Like there's some of the most precious beings, like in my opinion, on earth, because they're so pure in a lot of ways. Like there is no money, there is no greed, there's just like, you know, survival in harmony with earth and each other, and there's like a whole ecosystem that's working, and we are in that mix too. Like we are a part of that. But I think since we have so much intelligence, there's a huge responsibility that comes with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
In my diorama, I collected some of the plants specimens from just around the museum. So, you know, as you walk past Starbucks, you might see some of those same plants that are electroplated in the display.
I thought one looked familiar.
And so I hope that people will, you know, as they walk around the city, realize that the city is part of nature. And, you know, there's a form of ecology called ruderal ecology, which is the ecology of disturbed places. It is the ecology of what grows after, and it's not necessarily the native plants that come back, but it's new plants, you know, or more hardy, you know, what we call weeds, and they prepare the soil. And it takes a long time before native species can come back, but it's part of a natural system. When I started electroplating plants, I was living in New York City, and I was walking around and seeing all these fenced-in vacant lots. And instead of thinking about them as a vacant lot, I was thinking about them as a peculiar garden. They were a strange kind of bit of nature that was not intended to be beautiful, but it was sort of left alone. There's so many areas around airports that are fenced off. And those places, actually, there are a lot of native species that thrive in these accidental nature preserves. And they found that there's some animals that they thought were extinct living in the DMZ between North and South Korea, because one of the few places that people didn't go. So I like to think of all these places as, not unnatural, but they're just peculiar ways that nature flourishes. Sorry, I had a thought and I lost it. But
No, but that was a good thought to end on. We're going to leave some time for some Q&As now, but just in a sentence or so, I think calls to action. Dr. Davis, do you have a call of action? Like, what would be the one actionable thing that you would say?
Well, if you want to save the most species, eat less meat, because it's actually not hunting or poaching that's killing most animals. It is habitat loss. And the biggest cause of habitat loss is raising food to feed to cows.
Thank you for that. Yesenia, one call to action?
I think it's important for us to remember, and I'm not saying this just from me, but like some of the most smartest people in the world, like, have been saying that we are one of the most, our kids and our kids' kids are, and us are the most important generation to exist because of how technology is being harnessed. Our technology is evolving and how we're harnessing our energy, and there's a huge responsibility that lies on our shoulders. And I think one of the most important responsibilities is just appreciating now and each other.
That's a good one. Thank you.
I would say hone your curiosity with the material world. As I walked around New York collecting plants, I started to be able to tell what was happening beneath the soil based on the plants that were growing. I could spot a leaky water main. I could spot a buried petroleum tank because a nut brown sedge would grow there. So hone your curiosity in the natural world and pay attention. I'm constantly staring at the side of the freeway looking for plants to collect. And when I find something new, I get really curious about what were the conditions that created this, that allowed this to survive. And so that curiosity is just throughout my whole life just led me. It's just pay attention to what catches your attention and follow it.
That's a good one. Thank you so much. I think we're going to now go to Q&A. So we'd love to hear your questions. If you do have a question, we'll probably only have time for a couple. If you come down here on this right side, one of our staff members has a microphone and you can ask a question. It's daunting because you have to go and walk over there.
Okay. You mentioned climate change, and I think I heard also environmental justice. And those are two concepts, obviously, that are under somewhat of an assault right now. Any thoughts on what people can do to sort of navigate, especially here in California? We have a state that's still promoting those concepts, but a federal government that's not. And I'm not sure if you have any ideas or thoughts about that.
Well, I think they can't stop you from promoting those concepts. So you can cancel, the government can cancel grants, or they can do things like that. That'll be tried in the courts, but you can always promote what you find really valuable.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about just surviving the next 3 years and 10 months and 2 days.
Not counting or anything.
I think it's also like what Matt is saying. You have more power and influence than you realize, especially now with social media and how many people you can reach. I mean, back in the day with marketing, they say one person equals 1 million people because that one person knows at least 2.5 people that tells 2.5 people each. And in essence, it's growing and growing and growing very rapidly. So I would say, be able to be confident that you do have influence and understand that as like when you reflect back the day, like you did something yourself. And I think that's the most important thing.
I would also add that I think the most important thing is finding common ground with people that have different opinions. I have friends that have drastically different opinions, and I don't write them off for that. We get into little fights, and then we get back to our friendship. But again, that's part of the material world. So many of these social media platforms are really controlled by a few people. So I don't necessarily know that social media has as much effect as just being kind and talking to people in an approachable, logical, empathetic way. Radical empathy, I think, is really important.
Plant seeds.
Plant seeds, that's a good one.
Grow food.
Growth, that is a very good one. Thank you for that question. Do we have any more audience questions?
Is there something that got you like specifically into like making dioramas and doing all this like nature stuff?
That's a great question.
I have been a painter for 35 years, and I started out painting landscape and thinking about them as kind of shoebox dioramas, that they are these magic windows. And then I started making sculpture with plants and found material. And the diorama was the first time that I was able to take those parts of my practice and put it together. And that was super exciting. And it's really just following that curiosity all the way through.
Yeah, I think for me, so I have like this weird, personally just speaking on my behalf, I grew up in it was called like the Piñata House. It's in South Central Los Angeles. And it was like this really weird, kind of felt like different world because there's like piñatas everywhere and hanging from the ceiling. Like, I don't know what's going on. But every time it was like understanding how different it was, it kind of reminded me of being in a dream. And then I started having a lot of dreams about piñatas and like huge, like weird landscapes and stuff like that. And I started practicing a lot with like lucid dreaming and like wake initiated lucid dreaming. And a big part of that is like just being like what kind of triggered me to be able to manipulate reality in the dreamscape was like being fascinated with everything that I was seeing. Like everything in the room was amazing. I'm like, whoa, this is crazy and this is cool. And like when you get lucid, you have complete power and control. Like literally you understand that everything that is in your view is because you created it in your mind. So then when I woke up, I was like, oh man, it'd be so cool like if I can kind of bring that concept into my waking life. Because I felt so out of control in this waking life. It wasn't as easy as it is when you're in a dream, you know? I was like, what if I just make like crazy like spaces that make me feel like I'm dreaming? I can pretend I'm dreaming in the real life, and then I can try to tap into some weird dimension, you know? And, just finding like-minded people and understanding that I wasn't the only one that kind of felt like there's something more to life. And I think dreams was like a huge inspiration, so...
Thanks for that question. That was a good one.
Well, as a neuroscientist, I've heard it described that we hallucinate reality.
Basically, yeah, the brain is like a prediction machine. It takes information and then it decides what makes sense. So our reality is our reality, but it's also not 100% what we think it is.
Exactly. It's pretty fascinating. There's a lot of magic. I'm like, what is going on? Manifestation and all this crazy stuff. I'm like, I don't know. Let's practice. I'm trying to win that lottery.
Oh, this has been an incredible conversation. I really enjoyed this discussion with the three of you. Thank you for sharing your insights and perspective. Can we have a round of applause for our panelists? So that is the end of our discussion, but just a reminder to please join us in the African Mammal Hall until 9 for our cocktail reception. And we also hope that you'll join us for the rest of the series. We have on March 13th, Taxidermy Challenges of a Lost Art, which should be really good. And also March 20th, The Many Faces of Conservation. And we can continue the conversation. But yeah, once more, thank you once again to our guest speakers, Yesenia Prieto, Saul Becker, and Dr. Matt Davis.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.